Ah, good morning, old friend. Nice to see you, Richard. I'm really excited to talk about your second book in the trilogy today. And so I'm really happy to be here, and I hope you're doing well.
Thank you very much. I always check every hour, and so far, so good. I'm doing fine, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your doing this, your insight, your perspicacity, and your generosity of spirit as a dear old friend have sustained me through many a day, and I appreciate your engaging in this conversation.
Great, Richard. Well, let's get right to it. I have a set of questions for you today. Hopefully, we're going to enlighten myself and the audience in terms of the second book. So let me go ahead and get started. This is the Mobius Vector book. And the first question I have for you talks about Nick's trauma. This trauma was caused by torturing prisoners, and in particular, one prisoner. Nick describes how the intelligence community beat himself to a pulp, psychologically, economically, reputationally, and from a mental health perspective. Which one do you think might be worse, the physical torture that a prisoner endures, or what Nick went through?
I think the worst is probably the experience as a result of torture. And the reason I say that is Nick is prompted by that, triggered by that, to have a turn around in his life and become a whistleblower. And one thing that whistleblowers hang on to, and I think with justification, is that as Drake said to me, who was persecuted pretty viciously as a whistleblower, he said they could take everything, but they couldn't take me. They couldn't take myself. They couldn't take my soul. And there's a law firm in DC that handles whistleblowers, and they advise you that if there's any motivation for doing it, other than conscience, you will not endure or last through what is done to you after you become a whistleblower. If it's revenge or money or any, excuse me, of those lesser motivations, they won't stand up to the assault on you. But if it's conscience, because you are your conscience, it is indivisible and solitary, and it can't be divided. You can't split it in half and give them part and keep part. You went into this because of the wholeness of your commitment, which somehow seized you. It's almost involuntary that you could not but respond to the wrong that you were seeing. And therefore, you can persist through that and, in fact, triumph. And as Mobius Vector illuminates quite a bit, after the whistleblowing episode, that's what you cling to as an identity. You are no longer a spy. I'm no longer a special agent. I'm a whistleblower. And it's hard to sustain that once the act that created it is done. And there's a whole section in Mobius Vector about that. And about the necessity to move on. The torture, on the other hand, so plunges deeply into who you are and your values and your very being, that when you have the kind of realization he had, that I'm doing this to myself, that when we do this to another human, we're doing it to all of us because we're all connected, a theme which is explored in real depth and detail in the third book, Mobius Out of Time. The impact of that is impossible to remediate entirely. So I think that's by far the worst. I'm going to keep sipping water. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So throughout the Mobius Vector, Nick has a new love interest, Valerie. And in the first book, there was a different love interest, and her name was Penny. And Valerie handles Nick's former profession and history in a much different, more effective way than Penny did. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, they really are different people, but Nick set it up completely differently. With Penny, from the time they met and had a a brief but passionate affair as young people and then stayed friends, he created an entire fictional narrative to present to her for 37 years, in which he explained his long absences as due to how far he had to go to new postings as a teacher. And he taught literature, and he made up stories about the classes, and he made up stories about the students. And he lied to her for 37 years. So when that exploded, there was no putting Humpty Dumpty together again. Those pieces of their relationship were done. And part of him never really got over that, but he stayed angry at her. But he also had an exchange with her along the way about her codependency as a counselor and a therapist, and how she refused to look at why she had chosen that profession with some similar motivation to why he had chosen his own. Now, Valerie, on the other hand, first he got to know her because she was waiting on him at the Barbican, the bar where a lot of their conversations took place. And she heard about his heroic act, and she witnessed how he handled it in the aftermath. And she became she idolized him to a degree because she thought that was heroic. And if you look at her relationships, which are named, one, her first husband killed himself in a motorcycle accident, and the second relationship was an abuser. She saw correctly that, and idealized to a degree correctly, that he would not be doing that. He was an older man, wiser, more experienced. I think he was, what was he, 15, 20 years older than Valerie when they met. And they fell in love. And he was so in need of someone like Valerie to enter his life. And he simply told her the truth. And she was a normal human being. That is, they refer to normals all the time as a tribe of people other than themselves, because how they had been socialized by the intelligence community made them genuinely an elite, but also very genuinely other than the people with whom they can converse. And she took upon herself the retraining of Nick so that he could learn how normal people operate. She grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. She had a normal upbringing in the Midwest. I draw on my wife somewhat for that, who was from Des Moines and had a normal upbringing in many ways in the Midwest, and who also served, not in the same degree, but served as a similar touchstone for me of how normal people viewed the world, because I have been immersed in a different world for a long, long time. So Valerie took upon herself, she's going to teach him how to tell the truth. And he has spent 20 plus years in his profession never telling the complete truth to anybody, lying a lot and presenting a false persona to many, but never telling the complete truth to those to whom he could not disclose what he was doing and who he really was. And he is totally upfront with her. And in the second book, in the Mobius Vector, he goes way beyond the first book in confessing what it was like in that room. He has to learn how to tell more and more the truth. And that means he has to learn how to deal with the PTSD he experienced more and more realistically as well. And Valerie was just a great partner for that. Plus, they both loved to have sex. He's not over the hill yet. She was sprightly and spry and attractive, and enough said about that. There were a lot of things going for them in the relationship that they both needed at the right time. And I don't remember if it was the second or third book, but Valerie says, drawing on the relationship that his friend had with his wife Miriam, that they had very great distance between them. They didn't talk to each other a lot, and it suited them both. And Valerie says, if you're out of town all the time and not talking to each other all the time, and you both like that, that works. And if you're together all the time in work and life, as Nick and I have become, that works. But if either one changes, it starts to move closer or further away, that's when a relationship has a challenge. When you abandon the tacit agreement you had about how much time you would or wouldn't speak to one another, or how you would maintain a longer distance relationship with plenty of love and respect and affection. You might know something about that too, because you're in and out of town, and you happen to have a wife who's as talented as anybody I've ever. Just she creates such beautiful, beautiful things. But that's a whole other story. I'm not interviewing you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do remember that in the second book. So having done some profiling work, I found it interesting that you observed that Nick often failed to be observant about everyday details and actions of people around him unless it was manipulating them. I sort of call that the meters on, the meters off.
Right.
Whereas Valerie seemed to be much more astute in her observations of people around her all the time. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Valerie owns up to being a classic codependent, to use a term that's overused and exaggerated, but she gloms onto people's feelings right away. She can't help but pick up on them. And she says to Nick, when he says that to her, that means you need people like me and Penny in your life. So any diagnosis, armchair diagnosis psychologically by one partner of another, always boomerangs like that. Because if you identify something in a spouse or spousal relationship correctly, you're also identifying the need you had for them to be like that, or you never would have, quote, what we call fall in love. You never would have fallen in love with them. You never would have hooked into them in the first place. It's called falling in love, and others have a diagnostic way of talking about it as a neurotic manifestation of your mutual needs. Doesn't matter which works. It works in life. So she's very astute at just observing people and picking up on them. And she was trained to do that better as in a call center where she worked. And then as a waitress and bartender, her job depended on her reading people, listening to them, getting who they were, and then to a smaller degree, exploiting it to sell them more drinks and food, knowing how to do that. Nick, on the other hand, as you say, he has been trained over many, many years to pay attention to what matters. And so he has learned to filter out things that don't matter. And I think it's in the third book where he's looking out at people sitting in a coffee shop, looking through the window at people passing on the walk. And he says, there are millions of them swarming around us like gnats, and they are not of any significance to us. It's like reading all the obituaries. We got lots and lots of them on Sunday here in the Twin Cities, and they don't matter. They're just pictures and bios. And then you suddenly stumble on someone, we lost Kevin Mitnick recently, someone you knew well, and then you have a totally different reaction. Nick tied into people very effectively when he needed them. And he had been trained in his work to do that. And if he didn't need them, they were insignificant. They were not persons of interest. And it's kind of like a salesperson. If they pick up right away that you're not going to buy, they're not as interested in you. But if you're a prospective customer, then they go full bore. Nick, like many in different professions, was always selling.
That's a fabulous quote. I like that. Right. So sort of relevant and related to that, what you just discussed, Valerie seems to be the opposite to Penny in terms of what Nick would disclose. Could you relate that to just what you just said?
Well, Nick never couldn't know what would have happened if he told Penny the truth from the beginning. It would have created a totally different relationship. She probably, being who she was and in denial about some aspects of her own motivations, she probably wouldn't have handled it so well. Penny knew from the beginning who he was. And she was able to accept that. I was talking to a mutual friend of ours, Jennifer Granick, who did a conversation like this, and she said, he's beyond redemption. He can't be redeemed. And she was questioning Penny's ability to accept him completely as he was. And I didn't buy that, because all of us in our relationships know we have presented our spouses finally with other truths or other aspects of ourselves that we had preferred not to disclose. And if the relationship works one way or another, they embrace us as we are. I think Penny says, Valerie says in the third book, a relationship works when you let someone else be who they are. And that's really the bottom line for all relationships. And it was Jennifer who pointed out when reviewing the first book that I was writing about all relationships anyway, because everybody does, to a smaller degree as a rule, what Nick did in his profession. You present your best face forward, and a famous quote from Nietzsche, in the war between autobiography and pride, pride always wins. Always. So I loved Valerie. I mean, there are people I know, and especially some aspects of my wife, who I love dearly after 40 years of building a relationship and learning what it takes for both of us to build a relationship that, now that we are older, is I would say more loving, more understanding, more considerate, more compassionate than ever, as we take care of each other at this stage of life. And it's different. Well, that's where if Nick and Valerie hang in for 40 years, that's likely where they'll find themselves. But there is a big age difference. And I've known people who have married people 15 and 20 years older or younger than themselves. And sooner or later, it ripens into an issue. Doesn't have to be a crisis, but it is an issue. And we'll see what happens with Nick and Valerie in the third book.
Great observations. I think I side with you rather than with Jennifer on this one. So, yeah. So forgive me, I'm going to read you a short quote and ask for your comments on this. So the quote from the second book is, "At the agencies, we were loyal to the mission and our code and comrades, but no one was committed to a cause or creed, or God forbid, a religion. A passionate attachment to an ultimate cause was taboo because it could give you the wrong priorities. As I said in my memoir, a person with a conscience was more dangerous than a mole."
Okay. Yeah, he said that, and I think he was right. A mole is operating out of expediency and self-interest and trying to be smarter than everybody else, and good at what he does, which is hide and exploit. But a person with a conscience, as I've said, a whistleblower, that's what they've got. You look at the movie, it's a great rendition of the story of Weigand from Tobacco, The Insider, and what they do to him. And all he's got is his conscience, which in his case ultimately prevails. It doesn't always. But if you're expedient, whether it was the tobacco industry or there are a number of industries I can name similar to it that haven't been called to the carpet yet and maybe never will, you have the same options. You go along to get along. You don't look closely at, I think it's a quote from Naked Lunch, at what's on the end of your fork, what you're eating for your meal of life. And it's just very, very difficult to control someone like that. There's a chapter in the third book called An Unguided Missile, and it's a quote from a spy novel about how dangerous an agent is if you can't control them. And I was once describing to my dear departed friend Brian Snow what I did in ministry that was similar to what intelligence professionals do, which is build relationships over the bridge of which emotion, sincerity, truth can then flow. And I did that, I said, in the ministry, and I've still done it my whole rest of my life, I hope, to try to enhance the freedom and power of the other person, to use what you know and learn to support them in becoming the most fully human being they can become. And Brian said, we do that too, but we do it to control them.
Mm.
And when I asked him about people who broke or had crises, and then they went to a therapist, and I know that therapists also report back to the agency what they're getting. I said, what do you do if you're not sure you can control them? He said, we watch them very, very carefully. There's a guy, 35 years at NSA, celebrated for his work on the side of the house that protected us. And that was in part, as he said to me one night, he couldn't handle what the 90% of the house, the other side of NSA, just did routinely. I remember a quote from him where someone from CIA would say, why are you guys bothering with all that intrusion and cyber? He says, let us just go in and do a black bag job, blow the safe and get the goods. And he wasn't constitutionally able to do the work in good conscience. And maybe that's why every one of the friends who became deeply close friends with me from CIA or NSA or DIA became friends. That somebody who had made peace with the contradictions of their work didn't have much of a need to explore it. But someone with a conscience, you can't predict what they're going to do. They may act out of their commitment to integrity, sincerity, spirituality, what they have learned to be true about the universe, in a way that contradicts the more expedient goals of the agency, which are based on self-interest and politics and winning. Above all, winning. Remember another dearly departed friend, Ken Olthoff, said the last line of a story I wrote, he said, was right on. He said, in the last analysis, even when someone's confessing what they've done, it's partial because we always need to prevail.
Wow, that's another fabulous quote. So I'm going to read another very short quote from the book. It's actually kind of a question to you. And so I think this is Nick talking in the second book, saying, I was the one who sat with his back to the wall, watching the door in a restaurant. I was the one who scoped out an exit through the kitchen. Did you ever know somebody like that?
Yes, I did. And I did it as well. In areas after 9/11, I remember reading a lot, everything I could about situational awareness and scoping out the environment. I was hyper vigilant. We were all traumatized by the media, which has as its sign-on motto, traumatize the public, scare the hell out of them, and then they'll come back. So those images of the planes hitting the building again and again and again were a conspiratorial need by the media, tacitly accepted, to traumatize the population, because that would serve their self-interest. No moral high ground there at all. If we had never seen those pictures and had only heard about the event, the effect would have been radically different. And that's true for people I know at AFOSI who have to scan thousands of pictures of child abuse to do that work. When you're looking at the picture, you're traumatized. If you just kind of, like most of us, know that it exists, it's bad, but it's not the same. So when I was in Israel, a bomber blew up himself and the guard and a waitress from France at the Blues Bar next door to my hotel. that makes an impression. His accomplice ran, wearing a heavy overcoat loaded with explosives, and of course, you don't swim far. His body washed up a couple of days later in Tel Aviv. But in Israel, there's a guard in front of every restaurant, every store. I went to a restaurant with a dear friend, and they were nervous through the whole thing. They said there was no guard, and they were constantly looking around. And I spent enough time in Israel to know that that just becomes what you have to do. So I didn't go anywhere without scoping out the crowd, and that has become habitual in a lesser way. When I'm going into a crowd, I look around to see if anything stands out, if there's any anomalous clothing or behavior. And it always helps to know if something happens, because we're having random shootings all the damn time, that you know how to duck, protect yourself, and get out if you have a route that doesn't take you straight into the shooter's gun barrel. So sure, and that's of people I have spoken to about this. Yes, I know, I know people who live like that.
Okay, great. So you talk about the need for excitement for Nick and how terrible boredom was when compared to his previous, more exciting, more dangerous life. Could you elaborate just a little bit about this?
Sure. I don't think I'm giving away the family jewels to say that that comes from my life as well. I have loved living on the edge. I became in love with the hacker ethos and the hacker crowd back 30 years ago when I went to DEF CON for the first time, almost 30 years ago, 27 years ago, and saw who was there and got to know people there, including intelligence professionals. Actually, Brian and Ken, two of the number of professionals I met at that very first DEF CON, who were there on behalf of their work to see what these kids were up to. That was a totally different day. I won't go into the comparison of then and now. But what I got, and Kim Zetter, a journalist who's really pretty sharp, she said at my first talk, what she got was how much I respected the people to whom I was speaking. And one of the young hackers at one of the very first talks, when I talked about social engineering and tried to escalate their understanding of it to make it a win-win situation, because then you weren't risking as much, to use social engineering, but to do it so it served the other as well as you. Someone came up and said, do you realize how highly he thinks of us to suggest something like that? And they got it, but it wasn't fake. I loved who I saw. Some became really dear, wonderful friends over many years of co-inhabiting that strange space. Okay, so what is a hacker? What is a spy? I mean, you have to thrive. You have, if you don't, you're in trouble. You have to love the rush you get from, let's say, breaking in. It could be breaking into the mind of another person. It could be breaking into secrets that they're trying to keep from you. It could be breaking into what the government is doing, sometimes nefariously, to hide its activities from the people it allegedly exists to protect and serve. You love to find out. Your need to know machine. And sometimes that eclipses how you go about it. I mean, dear Kevin, he didn't hurt much at all. But he loved outsmarting everybody. And he was smarter than everybody but the guy who brought him down. We love to know more. We do genuinely, let's say it, see more of a certain dimension of human behavior and activity and cultural real norms than a lot of people even care to see. And when I was giving speeches, or years ago, somebody would sometimes interrupt and say, I don't want to know that. You're scaring me. I don't want to know that. And I said, well, it's real. Let's start with reality and then move on from there. Otherwise, you're going to have to spend an awful lot of time cushioned from reality before you even get across the street to it. And that's simply true. So we want to deal with reality, and that's both the good. In the third book, it plunges into the depths of the good as well as the evil that humans do. And in the ministry for 20 years, that was my life as well. I facilitated conversations, which, as I said, hopefully served the people, but they also served me by teaching me the possibilities for resilience and even heroism of ordinary people when life came down on them hard, as it often did and undeservedly. So we thrive on the edge. We thrive on the anomalous. All scientists are ultimately, sooner or later, looking for an anomaly that contradicts what it is they believe. And that's a major theme in the third book as well. A paradigm is a prison, I say in the third book, and we who are in it are the guards. The prisoners are the guards, and we all protect our system of belief and our understanding. But some of us make an accommodation with that in order to search out the anomaly, which, as Richard Feynman said, genius, an anomaly that is both true and anomalous can be the cornerstone of an entirely different way of looking at the issue or the problem, or even in some cases, the belief system that you construct. And I've talked to journalists about that as well, when their sources tell them, as one of my friends told me once, something that was so contradictory of what I fundamentally believed to be really happening, that, as a journalist said to me, I lived underwater for weeks. And they said that happened 4 times with CIA sources who said, no, as my friend said, do you want to know what really happened? And it so undermines the whole structure of your belief system that you really have to say, if that's true, I don't know what else is true or not true. I just don't know. And you have to live with that high degree of cognitive dissonance, forming belief systems that are tentative and good enough for now, while holding them lightly and understanding how partial and incomplete they really are. That's really the march of science, should be, for good scientists as well.
I've studied the hacking community for over 20 years, and I share your passion for their community. They're incredibly unique, and you described very nicely how theory and how you have to be observant, et cetera. Really fabulous answer. Thank you, Richard.
Curiosity, right?
Yes.
The major mark of intelligence. And I'm in a culture now in the Twin Cities where curiosity is sometimes thought by natives to be a sin. Don't ask personal questions like, hello, or who are you? I was in line at the post office the other day. The guy said, you're not from here, are you? And I said, how do you know? He says, because you're talking to me. Lots of stories after 6 years in the Twin Cities.
Sometimes curiosity doesn't kill the cat.
Right.
So you mentioned the clergy, and so I have a very short quote from the second book that I thought was curious and wanted to see what you thought about it. The quote goes like this: clergy were masters of sleight of hand on a level that rivaled the agencies. Could you comment on that?
The paradigm has changed for forming or preparing Episcopal clergy for the ministry. When I was in the day, they said you needed 3 years of seminary, you needed to be formed. What they really meant is you needed to be totally turned inside out and trained to see the world in a particular way, not least of which was wearing a dress and not minding. Call it an alb, and you can learn not to trip on it. But you're talking about medieval costume that doesn't bother you to wear. That's a sign or a symbol of the whole 3-year process, which was learning to see the world in a different way, learning to build the persona of a clergyman, and know the difference between that persona and who you were as a human being. And they were very clear in my training. My mentors were great at this. If you don't know the difference, you will not last very long in parish ministry. You cannot go simply on what you believe. You have to have a bifurcated point of view in which you know the difference between what you believe and present as a persona and the other aspects of yourself the other aspects. They don't have to be horrific, but they just have to be other than the persona you are learning to fulfill. Because the persona is what creates the projections on the parts of people in parishes or churches or synagogues or whatever. They put projections on you. In short, you look better to them than you are, or you look worse to them than you are. But they don't see the full human being. And if they want to become your friends, they want to become friends with the persona of the clergy, not with you, because that's not you. And when you're out of the smock, and just being yourself, when clergy got together, you know, I was going to say you couldn't believe, but I bet you could believe the conversations and what we talked about when we went off on retreat, because, you know, and then you had to just shut that down, go back to the parish and play the role again. I disagree with the notion that there's an ontological change when you are ordained to the clergy. I believe it's a role which you have to be socialized and trained to understand and accept and distinguish from yourself. Ideally, for a spy, that's going to be the same. I remember a guy in his 50s who said to me, boy, I played so many different roles in different situations that I don't even know who I am anymore. That's what you lose. You lose your genuine self, your psyche, your soul, and you don't know where to find it. That's a danger if you're not finding an alternative to what you say on Sunday, where you can be more fully yourself, and own it, and then take your self-knowledge, which is ultimately knowledge of the people you're serving, back into the transactions in which you have to engage. So that's what I had in mind.
Oh, okay, good. That actually leads into the next question. In the second book, Nick says, basically, he says, why do I cite books and movies in media so much? Because I have no real past. References to films and literature make incidents in my life seem more meaningful than they are. I've sometimes referred to those unique experiences in my life as movie moments.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, maybe you could share some observations about that.
Well, I've heard it said that men quote movies much more often than women. I don't know, maybe with the new onslaught of female directed, female acted, female Barbified movies coming, that will be different. But we do quote things a lot. I don't think there's a male American alive doesn't know what going to the mattresses means. And there are movies I've seen so many times over that I have loved deeply. I was talking to a friend from NSA the other day, and I quoted from the Big Lebowski. And I said, you know, Leeds, when his car is stolen and the policeman just bursts into laughter. He's Leeds. Oh yeah, we got lots of leads. He finished the sentences. We could do the Big Lebowski from start to finish. I know people with whom I could do Blade Runner from start to finish, both the voiceover version and the director's cut. We know it so well that those well-crafted lines have become deeply a part of our understanding. Hate to say it, but that's me, especially during COVID. So much of my life, but so much of my life has always been seeing great films, the ones I really love, reading endlessly, both fiction and nonfiction. I mean, I taught literature. It became part of me, and it became a difficulty as a speaker when those narratives that were part of me could not be mentioned in a speech. An example is a movie, Chinatown, which I think is a classic. I could do that one by heart, but it hit me the other day. My God, that movie came out 50 years ago. And I quoted from it during a talk for O'Reilly in New York, where I said, it's Chinatown, Jake. It's Chinatown. Everybody who knows that movie knows what that meant. Nobody in that room, all of whom were much younger than me, knew what it meant. My handler came up and said that to me, and another speaker came up. He said, watch, I'll show you how to do it. Every one of his examples of weakness and security came from Star Wars, starting with the Death Star. And everybody knew what he meant because they shared that narrative. So it has become difficult to be a classicist. Even when I watch Jeopardy, smart people know nothing about religion or literature. Nothing. I mean, they don't answer any questions about it, but ask them trivia about almost any other domain, and they get it. And the other day there was a quote, a question, our Father who art in heaven, blank be thy name. Not one of the three people knew the missing word was hallowed. Not one of them knew the first line of the Lord's Prayer. And these are people chosen for their smarts. So my life has been steeped in literature, and growing up as I did, I don't want to go into it too deeply, but my father dropped dead when I was 2. My mother had to go back to work full time, which she did until she died of cancer when I was 20. To a degree, I raised myself, and I raised myself on television, movies, and books. I read a lot, and I think it saved my life, but I also became enamored of great literature. And it's a very difficult thing for me today to try to produce literature, which these Mobius books all are, especially the third one is top drawer literature, because people aren't reading literature. They're reading entertainment fiction. And that's what publishers are looking for. And that's what agents are providing. And I can do a whole hour on that, but I don't need to. That's just what's so. And the 5 or 6 major publishers who publish 80% of what's shoveled out there, shovelware, you get a brand, you keep it moving, you write 1 a year, you have a stable of other writers, you oversee it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been my life.
Oh, wow. We're coming up on the top of the hour. We have time for probably a couple more questions, Richard.
Okay.
All righty. So Nick makes an observation about the intelligence community. I'll read this short quote. We built a haunted house, and now we wander through it, startled when a banshee wails or spooks jump out of the dark. Spooks is the perfect name for us. We are caught in this grim carnival like the geek in his addiction. I thought that was a pretty marvelous observation.
Well, it means that we accept at the outset when we are told and indoctrinated into and conditioned to and socialized to the norms and values of the intelligence community. Once you accept them, there's excitement, there's specialness. I'm special, I'm different, I'm being trained to know things that other people don't know, and I have a get out of jail free card. I am empowered to break the law in every country in the world, and then there's lip service to accept ours until 9/11, in which case we broke the law so much in our own country that we had to change the law and change the court decisions and create new courts to educate decisions about the laws we created in order to justify things that had always been illegal to do, that we said the necessity of the moment and the changes in culture and information security mandated that we do. So we created that world, and then the more you're in it, the deeper and deeper you go. As I say, you come to terms with it, you rationalize what you're doing, you justify it, and that's what you hear from the intelligence community a lot. But periodically, the fact that it fundamentally contradicts what you say you are serving and protecting, which is a system of law, a system of ethics, an ethos, there's a fundamental contradiction, because you are breaking the law all the time in other countries. And periodically there's a pseudo scandal where, oh my God, they found us listening into the Germans or the English or the Dutch or whatever. And everybody's always listening in to everybody else. Assistant director, I think it was, of SIGINT said in the director's office, we have no friends, we have no allies, we have targets. All we have are targets. Well, when you live like that, you have to justify and rationalize that entire panoply of beliefs and norms and values. And you do. But periodically they will jump out of the dark at you and grab you by the throat. And that's what happened to Nick when he realized that the torture we engaged in after 9/11, we killed people. We killed innocent people. We tortured them to death. And you can go all the way up the chain to see, I wrote a column years ago in which Dershowitz was advocating, thinking about torture. And I said, that's it. We're going to go full bore on torture, because if it's thinkable and it's debatable, then that side of the debate is ultimately going to prevail, at least to a degree, and it has.
Mhm. This leads into the final question. One last quote. The myths of the intelligence world were based on similar fictions. Our system was equally fragile, sustained by a refusal to look at the lunch we were eating, the naked lunch on the end of the fork. We too had to believe or it wouldn't work. What a fabulous observation. Maybe you could close this out with some comments about that.
Yeah, it's totally congruent with what we've just been addressing. It's and in a way, having come from a religious background in part, it was the same. If you saw through the idiocy of some of the things that people check their brain at the door in order to accept when they walked into a church, if you saw through it, you had to come to terms with it. In seminary, you were trained to come to terms with it by moving into a condition we call secondary naivete, and it applies to your question. Primary naivete is someone who believes at the top level the explicit statements of the belief system in which they have been socialized. Secondary naivete is when you adopt a way, using in the ministry, it was critical thinking, it was historical analysis, it was literary analysis. It was treating the text as text in all the ways that texts exist, and you came to good conclusions, but they were different. And they contextualized what you read or what you believed in a very different way. And those two different ways of seeing things are the difference between literalism and thoughtful, nuanced understanding of how you have to restate Bronze Age statements. I mean, if you really listen to what you're saying, when I say you check your brain at the door, I've never seen anything more than, you come in and you go into a trance. You get on your knees, which is a kind of infantile posture, a fetal position. You call someone who is not your father, father. You become a child again, and you accept even the most horrendous things that they are doing in the dark. You just stop thinking about things and the consequences and the contradictions of what you're doing. So you have to not see that in order to believe straight up in primary naivete way what you're saying and what people are affirming in their rituals and rites and from the pulpit. And that is the difference. The literalist churches, whether they're evangelical or Orthodox Judaism or whatever, those who have become rigid and unyielding because they are clinging to an interpretation, which if they would only be willing to examine it critically, they would realize they would have to restate in a nuanced way that is congruent with 20th century, 21st century reality. Secondary naivete. We were taught to do that in the ministry. Then you have to learn how to articulate the deeper truths that method really reveals about life and reality and spirituality to people who don't know what you're doing. And that's a real problem. I joined a group at this little church briefly when I moved here. I was looking for friends and community, and I said that I said I thought I was in a like-minded group because I thought they were educated people who understood about biblical criticism. And I said, what you manifested when you were in the fundamentalist camp was invincible ignorance. And everybody hooted and hollered. I found there was only one other person out of 20 around the table who knew what I was even talking about. And they got very angry. We're very civil here in Minnesota, they said. We don't say things like that. And I said, well, you can't tell me you believe literally everything in the Bible. And I said to the leader of the group, I said, for example, do you really believe that Jonah was swallowed by a whale? And he said, and I quote, "It might not have been a whale, but it was certainly a very large fish."
No. Ah,
At that point, there's no conversation. And that's the problem. Whether it's politics or religion or what you believe is real, given the advances of science and technology. We're in deep trouble right now with a schism between people who question that and are willing to explore it, and those who cling of necessity to a belief, because if they let go of it, they feel they'll drown in a sea of not knowing. And that's partially true. If you don't have the tools and techniques for critical thinking, you can't do it. And therefore, you take the default position, which is don't think about it. Just accept what you were taught, accept what someone says during their rally, accept the most obvious falsehoods and nonsense, and go with it, because you don't know who you'd be if you were.
Wow. What an amazing observation. Wow. What a fabulous way to spend an hour. An incredibly insightful and rare interview, Richard. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you today. Thank you so very much for spending some time with us.
It's been a wonderful conversation with you. Of course, you know all the questions to ask because you're as smart as they get. And you understand in a very nuanced way everything I'm talking about.
Correct, sir. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, sir. Good luck with the third book, and hopefully I'll get a chance to read it in the near future, and looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye, Richard.
Bye-bye.